What if World War II never happened? How would the world be organized? Imagine what would have happened if Hitler had never started World War II. How would the world look if there had been no devastating destruction, millions of casualties, and decades of political instability? How would countries have developed, and what would have changed in world politics and economics? Let's take a step away from real history and explore how events might have unfolded in this alternate world. The first thing that comes to mind is how relations between countries would have developed. In our world, World War II changed the balance of power in Europe, Asia, and America. The war overturned geopolitical maps, creating blocs that remained in a Cold War state for decades. But what if there had been no war? Would there have been a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union? Perhaps conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or even the Cuban Missile Crisis might never have occurred. The absence of a global conflict could have led to a less intense ideological clash between communism and capitalism. The USSR wouldn't have been forced to spend enormous resources on military needs, which might have allowed it to focus on internal development, improving citizens' living standards, and exploring space. Without the need to engage in war, the United States would likely have continued developing its economy and technology. Without massive military spending, the U.S. could have fully focused on innovation and scientific research, potentially making it an even more dominant nation in computer technology, biotechnology, and nuclear energy. Notably, areas like missile technology and space exploration could have developed much faster without the reliance on military competition. Without the devastating wars like World War I and World War II, Europe could have taken decades to rebuild, leading to more stable economic and social development. Instead of rebuilding from destruction, European countries could have focused on modernizing their industries and strengthening political institutions. Consider this: perhaps without World War II, humanity could have reached new heights in medical technology and treatment. The global community could have accelerated its efforts in the development of medicine, healthcare technologies, and social systems. In a peaceful world, these achievements might have come much faster than after large-scale catastrophes that forced nations to mobilize their scientific resources. How would the world have changed socially and culturally without World War II? Fewer destructions, fewer losses. It's obvious that this would have affected people and their social systems. For example, after the war, many countries experienced a population boom linked to the economic recovery and job creation. Without World War II, the economic boom in the US, Europe, and other countries might have been much milder and prolonged. Without wars forcing nations to mobilize and allocate resources for military needs, populations could have continued to develop their countries more actively. Additionally, without the destruction of cities and infrastructure, many countries could have avoided the post-war economic crisis and severe shortages that paralyzed the global economy. As for the role of women in society after World War II, women played a huge role in rebuilding the economy and industry. They stood alongside men, working in factories, including heavy industry. This led to significant changes in social and cultural norms and accelerated the movement for women's equality and improvement of their rights. Without the war, this social evolution might have occurred more slowly, and women wouldn't have gained such a significant role in industrial and economic life. Additionally, after the war, Europe experienced significant migration as people from Eastern Europe and other regions sought refuge in countries freed from Nazi oppression. However, without the war, these processes might have been much slower, and migration in search of a better future wouldn't have been so massive. Cultural and social practices would have played a role in a peaceful world. In the post-war years, culture and the arts began to rise. Without World War II, music, literature, and theater movements might have developed differently. Given the world economy, art and culture could have had a completely different growth trajectory. Remember how, in the 1950s, the cultural rise in the U.S. was accompanied by the development of rock and roll and other musical styles. In Europe, despite post-war difficulties, new trends in art, architecture, and cinema emerged. But interestingly, without Without the war, this cultural phenomenon might not have arrived so quickly, and perhaps we wouldn't have seen such rapid changes in cultural trends. Additionally, without World War II, the process of decolonization might have taken longer. Many countries like India and those in Africa would still have been under colonial rule, and their independence process could have been slower and more prolonged. As a result, political liberation for third world countries might have taken much more time. Could we imagine a world without racial and ethnic conflicts that were typical of the 20th century? Without World War II and the racial clashes connected to it, processes for human rights development and minority protection could have been accelerated. Many social justice issues would likely have been resolved much earlier if not for the need to rebuild countries after the war. Moreover, in a world without war, approaches to arms and military technology development could have changed. The U.S. and other global powers would have continued to invest in military advancements, but the need for tactical developments could have been different. This could have meant that the arms race could have developed in a completely different way, possibly even faster. It's important to note the environmental consequences. World War II and its aftermath led to significant changes in the use of natural resources and environmental pollution. The technologies and scales of production introduced during the war threatened nature and ecological sustainability. The global economy and production could have evolved differently without these global catastrophes and threats, with much smaller impacts on ecosystems. What would the world have been like without World War II? It likely could have been more stable, with less destruction, and possibly more innovation in technology and science. But despite all the possible advantages, we also see how much of what developed after the war served as a catalyst for new changes and disruptions. It's impossible to definitively answer the question of what the world without war would have brought. But one thing is clear: it would have been a very different place. So how would the world have changed socially and culturally if Hitler had never started World War II? Fewer destructions, fewer losses. This clearly would have affected people and their social systems. For example, after the war, many countries experienced massive population growth linked to economic recovery and job creation. Without World War II, the economic boom in the US, Europe, and other countries might have been much milder and prolonged.